Dusan Barok is an artist and writer involved in the fields of software, art and theory. He's a founding editor of Monoscope, a wiki for collaborative studies of art, media and humanities, and a member of the collective La Société Anonyme. It just like turned off. Okay. Yeah, so usually I like to tease Dusan saying about like his enormous work on Monoscope now being more and more recognized and getting the scale of fame of Ubu. And then Dusan always complains that that's the collective work. And I agree, but again, as you can see, I like to bring that attention and say that I'm super impressed by the sensibility and the amount of work what Dusan did. You should check, Monoscope is here as a work. There is Monoscope Wiki, and then there is Monoscope blog, which became like probably one of the most respected stream of new books at the moment in these fields in between and in the field of media theory, experimental sound, concrete poetry, politics, and many other stuff. Dusan, please.
Thanks, Marcell, and I really appreciate to be invited here, and thank you all for coming. Also, I have to say that I'm happy that this thing is taking place already, because I don't need to write anymore. I set myself a quite challenging topic, and I was wondering whether I can say anything meaningful. So it took longer than I expected. So I'm sorry to miss some talks. I will, if they will be published, I will be happy to go through them afterwards. So in this talk, I'm going to attempt to identify particular cultural algorithms. In other words, processes in which culture practices and software meet. With them, a sphere is implied, in which algorithms gather to form bodies of practices, and in which cultures gather around algorithms. I'm going to approach them through the perspective of my practice as a culture worker, editor and artist, considering practice in the same rank as theory and poetics, and where theorization of practice can also lead to the identification of poetical devices. The primary motivation for my talk is an attempt to figure out where do we stand as operators, users, and perhaps communities gathering around infrastructures containing a massive body of text, among other things, and what sort of things might be considered to make a difference, or to keep making a difference. The talk mainly considers the role of text and the word in research, by way of several figures. A reference, list, scheme, table, index, those things that intervene in the flow of narrative, illustrating the point, perhaps in a more economic way than the linear text would do. Yet they don't function as pictures. They are primarily texts arranged into figures. Their forms have been standardized over centuries, withstood the transition to the digital without any significant change, being completely intuitive to the modern reader. Compared to the body of text, they are secondary, run parallel to it. Their function is, however, different to that of the punctuation. They are there neither to shape the narrative, nor to aid structuring the argument into logical blocks, nor is their function spatial, like in visual poems. Their positions within document are determined according to the sequential order of the text, standing as attachments, and they are there to clarify the nature of relations among elements of the subject matter, or to establish relations with other documents. The premise of my talk is that these textual figures also came to serve as the abstract models determining possible relations among documents as such, and in consequence, the structure conditions of research. It can be said that research, as inquiry into subject matter, consists of discrete queries. A query, such as a question about what something is, what kinds, parts, and properties does it have, and so on, can be consulted in existing documents or generate new documents based on collection of data in the field and through experiment, before proceeding to reasoning, to arguments and deductions. Formulation of a query is determined by protocols providing access to documents, which means that there is a difference between collecting data outside the archive, the undocumented, for instance, in the field and through experiment, consulting with a person, an archivist, expert librarian, documentalist, and consulting with a database storing documents. The phenomena, such as deepening of specialization and throughout digitization, have given privilege to the database as the fundamental means for research. Obviously, this is a very recent phenomenon. Queries were once formulated in natural language. Now, given the fact that databases are queried using SQL language, their interfaces are mere extensions of it, and researchers pose their questions by manipulating drop-downs, checkboxes, and input boxes meshed together on a flat screen being ran by software that in turn translates them into a long line of condition selects and joins performed on tables of data. Specialization, digitization, and networking have changed the language of questioning. Inquiry, once attached to the flesh and paper, has been entrusted to the digital and networked. Researchers are querying the black box. Searching in a collection of assembled taggable documents, on a bookshelf, is different from searching in a systematically structured repository, such as a library, and even more so from searching in a digital repository, such as a digital library. Not that they are mutually exclusive, one can devise structures and algorithms to search through a printed text or read books in a library one by one. There are other models embodying various processes associated with a query. These properties of the query might be called the sequence, the structure, and the index. If they are present in the ways of querying documents, and we will return to this issue, are they persistent within the inquiry as such? This question itself is a rupture in sequence. It makes a demand to depart from one narrative, a continuous flow of words, to another, to figure out while remaining bound to it. So there has been one sequence or line of the inquiry about the kinds of the query and its properties. That sequence itself is a digression from within the sequence about what is research and describing its part as queries. We are thus returning and continue with the question whether the properties of the inquiry are the same as the properties of the query. But isn't it true that every single utterance occurring in a sequence yields a query as well? Let's consider the word utterance. It can produce a number of associations. For example, with how Foucault employs the notion of énoncé in his archaeology of knowledge, giving a hard time to his English translators, wondering whether utterance or statement is more appropriate, or whether they are interchangeable, and what impact would each choice have on his reception in the Anglophone world. Limiting ourselves to textual forms for now, and not translating his work, but pursuing a different inquiry, let us say the utterance is a word, or a phrase, or an idiom, in a sequence, such as a sentence, a paragraph, or a document. This distinction is as old as recorded Western thought, since both Plato and Aristotle differentiate between a word on its own, the said, a thing said, and words in the company of other words. For example, Aristotle's categories lay on the notion of words on their own, and they are made the subject matter of that inquiry. For him, the ambiguity of connotation words produce lies in their synonymity, understood differently from the moderns, not as more words denoting a similar thing, but rather one word denoting various things. Categories were outlined as a device to differentiate among words according to kinds of these things. Every word as such belonged to not less and not more than one of 10 categories. So it happens to the word utterance, as to any other word uttered in a sequence, that it poses a question, a query, about what share of the spectrum of possibly denoted things might yield as the most appropriate in a given context. The more context, the more precise share comes to the fore. When taken out of the context, ambiguity prevails as the spectrum unveils in its variety. Thus, single words, as any other utterances, are questions, queries themselves, and by occurring in statements in context, their means are being singled out. This process is conditioned by what has been formalized as the techniques of regulating definitions of words. Dictionaries have had a long life. The ancient Greek scholar and poet Philetas of Kos, living in the 4th century BCE, wrote the vocabulary explaining the meanings of rare Homeric and other literary words, as well as words from local dialects and technical terms. The vocabulary called disorderly words has been lost with the fragments quoted by later authors. One example is that the word pela meant one cup in the ancient Greek region of Boeotia, contrasted to the same word meaning milk pail in Homer's Iliad. Not much has changed in a way how dictionaries constitute order. Selected archives of statements are queried to yield occurrences of particular words. Various criteria are applied to filtering and sorting them, and in turn the spectrum of denoted things located in this way is structured into groups and subgroups, which are then given according to other set of rules, shorter or longer names. These constitute facets of potential meanings of a word. So there are at least 4 sets of conditions structuring dictionaries. One is required to delimit an archive corpus of texts, another to select and give preference or weights to occurrences of a word, another to cluster them, and yet another to abstract or generalize the subject matter of each of these clusters. Needless to say, this is a craft of a few, and these criteria are rarely beyond being disclosed, despite their impact on research and, more generally, their influence as conditions of production of a so-called common sense. It doesn't take that much to reimagine what a dictionary is and what it could be, especially having large specialized corpora of texts at hand. This can also serve as aids in production of new words and new meanings. Another formalized and internalized process being at play when figuring out a word is its containment. Word is not only structured by way of things it potentially denotes, but also by words it is potentially part of and those it contains. The fuzz around categorization of knowledge and the world in the Western thought can be traced back to Porphyry, if not further. In his introduction to Aristotle's categories, this 3rd century AD Neoplatonist began expanding the notions of genus and species into their hypothetic consequences. Aristotle's brief work outlines 10 categories of things that are said, or legomena, namely substance, or rather substantive, quantity, qualification, relation, where, when, being in a position, having a relation, doing, and being affected. In his different work, Topics, Aristotle outlines 4 kinds of subject or materials indicated in propositions and problems from which arguments and deductions start. These are a definition, a genus, a property, and then accident. Porphyry does not explicitly refer topics in his introduction to for 3rd century Aristotle's categories, and says he omits speaking about genera and species as to whether they subsist in the nature of things or in mere conceptions only. Which means he avoids explicating whether he talks about kinds of concepts or kinds of things in the sensible world. Concepts or things in the sensible world. However, the work sparked confusion, as the following passage suggests. Now, it's a quote from 19th century English translation from the introduction. In each category, there are certain things most generic and again, others most special, and between the most generic and the most special, others which are alike called both genera and species, but the most generic is that above which there cannot be another superior genus, and the most special, and below which there cannot be another inferior species. Between the most generic and the most special, there are others which are alike both genera and species, referred, nevertheless, to different things. But what is stated may become clear in one category. And I give this example. Substance, indeed, is itself genus. Under this is body. Under body, animated body. Under which is animal. Under animal, rational animal. Under which is man. Under man, Socrates, Plato, and man particularly. Porphyry took one of Aristotle's 10 categories of the word, substance. Well, substance was one of these categories and was by no means meant as a matter, and dissected it using one of his 4 rhetorical devices, genus. While employing Aristotle's categories, genera and species as means for logical operations, for dialectic, Porphyry's interpretation bore more resemblance to the perceived structures of the world. So they began to bloom. There were early examples, but Porphyry was the most influential in injecting the universalist version of classification, implying the figure of a tree into the locus of Aristotle's thought. Knowledge became monotheistic. Classification schemes, going from one point or one end, play a major role in untangling the format of modern encyclopedia from that of the dictionary, which has been governed by alphabet. 2 of the most influential encyclopedias of the 18th century are cases in the point. Although still keeping dictionary in their titles, they are conceived not to represent words, but knowledge. The uppermost genus of the body was set as the body of knowledge. The English Cyclopedia, or a Universal Dictionary of Arts and Sciences, from 1728, splits into 2 main branches, natural and scientifical, and artificial and technical. And then further splits into 47 divisions, with classed lists on the following pages of the articles belonging to each, intended to serve as a table of contents. The French Encyclopedia, or Systematic Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts and Crafts, unwinds from judgment and sentiment, and branches into memory as history, reason as philosophy, and imagination as poetry. The logic of containers was employed as an aid not only to deal with the enormous task of naming and not omitting anything from what is known, but also for the management of labor of hundreds of writers and researchers, to create a mechanism for delegating work and distribution of responsibilities. Flesh was also more present in the field research, with researchers attending workshops and sites of everyday life to annotate it. The world came forward to enshrine the word in other schemes. Darwin's theory of evolution, this is from Haeckel, and some of the modern document classification systems, such as Charles Cutter's expansive classification from 1892, set to classify the world itself and set the field for what has come to be known as authority lists, structuring metadata in today's computing. So to sum up the part on structure, facetization of meaning and branching of knowledge are both the domain of the unit of utterance. While lexicographers or dictionarists structure thought through multi-layered processes of abstraction of the written record, knowledge growers dissect it into hierarchies of mutually contained notions. One seeks to describe the word as a faceted list of small worlds, another to describe the world as a structured list of words. One play prime in the domain of epistemology, in what is known, controlling the vocabulary, another in the domain of ontology, in what is, controlling reality. Every word has its given things. Everything has its place, closer or further from a single word. The schism between classifying words and classifying the world implies it is not possible to construct a universal classification scheme. On top of that, any classification system of words is bound to a corpus of texts it is operating upon, and any classification system of the world again operates with words which are bound to a vocabulary, which is again bound to a corpus of texts. However, it doesn't mean it would prevent people from trying. Classifications function as descriptors of and inscriptors upon the world, imprinting their authority. They operate from a locus of their corpus specificity. The larger the corpus, the more power it has on shaping the world, as far as the word shapes it. And yes, I do imply Google here, for which it is a domain to be potentially exploited, if not already. The structure-yielding query of the single word shrinks with preceding and following words. Inquiry proceeds in the flow that establishes another kind of relationality, chaining words into the sequence. While the structuring property of the query brings words apart from each other, its sequential property establishes continuity and brings these units into an ordered set. This is what is responsible for attaching textual figures mentioned earlier, such as lists, schemes, and tables, to the body of the text. Associations can be also stated explicitly by indexing tables and then referring them from a particular point in the text. The same goes for explicit associations made between blocks of the text by means of indexed paragraphs, chapters, and pages. From this follows that all utterances point to the following utterance by the nature of sequential order, and indexing provides means for pointing elsewhere in the document as well. A lot can be said about references to other texts. Here, to spare time, I would refer you to a talk I gave a few months ago, which is online. It's called Communing Texts. So this is still the realm of print. So what happens with document when it is digitized? Digitization breaks the document into units of which each is assigned a numbered position in the sequence of a document. From this perspective, digitization can be viewed as a total indexation of the document. It is converted, the document is converted into units rendered for machine operations. This sequentiality is made explicit by means of an underlying index. Sequences and chains are orders of one dimension. Their one-dimensional ordering allows addressability of each element and random access. Jumps between random addresses are still sequential, processing elements one at a time. Now I'll turn to the index. The sequencing not only weaves words into statements, but activates other temporalities and presents occurrences of words from past statements. As now when I'm saying the word utterance, each time there surface contexts in which I have used it earlier. Now let me read you a longer quote from a book by got the first name, last name, Gerber, called The Evolution of Books from 1998. A century of invention of various types of indexes and reference tools preceded the advent of the first subject index to a specific book, which occurred in the last years of the 13th century. The first subject indexes were distinctions, collections of various figurative or symbolic meanings of a noun found in the scriptures that are the earliest of all alphabetical tools aside from dictionaries. By the end of the third decade of the 13th century, Hugh de Saint-Cher had produced the first word concordance. It was a simple word index of the Bible, which, with every location of each word listed by its position in the Bible, specified by book, chapter, and letter, indicating part of the chapter, or indicating part of the chapter, and indicating. Hugh organized several dozen men, assigning to each man an initial letter to search. For example, the man assigned M was to go through the entire Bible, list each word beginning with M, and give its location. As it was soon perceived that this original reference word would be even more useful if words were cited in context, a second concordance was produced, with each word in lengthy context, but it proved to be unwieldy. Soon a third version was produced with words in context of 4 to 7 words, the model for biblical concordances ever since. Still continuing in our quote. The subject index, also an innovation of the 13th century, evolved over the same period as did the concordance. Most of the early topical indexes were designed for writing sermons. Some were organized, while others were apparently sequential without any arrangement. By mid-century, the entries were in alphabetical order, except for a few in some classified arrangement. Until the end of the century, these alphabetical reference works indexed a small group of books. Finally, John of Freiburg added an alphabetical subject index to his own book called Summa Confessorum. So, by the end of the 13th century, the practical utility of the subject index is taken for granted by the literate West, no longer solely as an aid for preachers, but also in the discipline of theology, philosophy, and both kinds of law. End of quote. In one sense, neither subject index nor concordance are indexes. They are words or a group of words selected according to given criteria from the body of the text, each accompanied with a list of identifiers. These identifiers are elements of an index, whether they represent a page, chapter, column, or other block of text. Every identifier is a unique address. The index is thus an ordering of sequence by means of associating its elements with a set of symbols, when each element is given a unique combination of symbols. Indexation is segmentation, a breaking into segments. From as early as the 13th century, the index, such as that of sections, has served as enabler of search. The more detailed indexation, the more precise search results it enables. The subject index and concordance are tables of search results. There is direct lineage from the 13th century biblical concordance and the birth of computational linguistic analysis. They were both initiated and realized by priests. During the Second World War, Jesuit father Roberto Busa began to look for machines for the automation of the linguistic analysis of the 11 million word Latin corpus of Thomas Aquinas and related authors. Working on his PhD thesis about the concept of presence in Aquinas, he realized two things. And I think it's worth of quoting him. It's not as long as the previous quote. So he says in 1980, Roberto Busa, I realized first that a philological and lexicographical inquiry into the verbal system of an author has to precede and prepare for a doctrinal interpretation of his works. Each writer expresses his conceptual system in and through his verbal system, with the consequence that the reader who masters this verbal system, using his own conceptual system, has to get an insight into the writer's conceptual system. The reader should not simply attach to the words he reads the significance they have in his mind, but should try to find out what significance they have in the writer's mind. Second, I realized that all functional or grammatical words, which in mind are not empty at all but philosophically rich, manifest the deepest logic of being, which generates the basic structures of human discourse. It is this basic logic that allows the transfer from what the words mean today to what they meant to the writer. The quote continues, "In the works of every philosopher, there are two philosophies. The one which he consciously intends to express, and the one he actually uses to express it. The structure of each sentence implies in itself some philosophical assumptions and truths. In this light, one can legitimately criticize a philosopher only when these two philosophies are in contradiction." End of quote. Collaborating with the IBM in New York from 1949, the work, a concordance of all the words of Thomas Aquinas, was finally published in the 70s in 56 printed volumes. A version of which is online since 2005. Besides that, an electronic lexicon for automatic lemmatization of Latin words was created by a team of 10 priests in the scope of 2 years, containing 150,000 forms. Father Busa has been dubbed the father of humanities computing, and recently also of digital humanities. The subject index has a crucial role in the printed book. It is the only means for search the book offers. Subjects composing an index can be selected according to a classification scheme, perhaps specific to a field of an inquiry, for example, as elements of a certain degree with a given minimum number of subclasses. Its role seemingly vanishes in the digital text, but it can be easily transformed. Besides serving as a table of pre-searched results, the subject index also gives a distinct idea about the content of the book. Two patterns give us a clue. Numbers of occurrences of selected words give subjects weights, while words that seem specific to the book and are present in the index outweigh other, even if they don't occur very often. A selection of these words then serves as a descriptor of the whole text and can be thought of as a specific kind of tags with T-A-G. This process was formalized in mathematical formula in the 70s. Thanks to by an information retrieval scientist, Karen Spark-Jones, and she called it inverse document frequency, or IDF, or in other words, term specificity. It is measured as a proportion of texts in the corpus where the word appears at least once to the total number of texts. Yeah. So you take a word from one text, and basically count how many other documents within corpus contain it. And then divided by the number of documents. When this number is multiplied by the frequency of a word in the text, we get what came to be called term frequency inverse document frequency, TF-IDF. In this way, we can get an automated list of subjects which are particular in the text when compared to a group of texts. We came to learn it by practice of searching the web. It is a mechanism not dissimilar to thought process involved in retrieving particular information online. And search engines have it built in their indexing algorithms as well. There is a paper I'm approaching the end. So there is a paper proposing attaching words generated by TF-IDF to the hyperlinks when referring websites. I could click on that link, but I won't. This would enable finding the referred content even after the link is dead. Hyperlinks in references in the paper use this feature, and it can be easily tested. So I click this link, which is dead. And the authors of the paper attached to every link this lexical signature, which contains not that many words. So, so this is a dead link. Works. Well, I didn't test many of them. I tested few, and all of them worked. But I don't. Yeah, it would be interesting to look further into it. There is another measure called Cosic similarity, which takes TF-IDF further and can be applied for clustering texts according to similarities in their specificity. This might be interesting as a feature for digital libraries, or even a way of organizing library bottom-up into novel categories. Perhaps new discourses could emerge. Or as an aid for researchers to sort through texts, or even for editors as an aid in producing interesting anthologies. So I have 3 final remarks, short ones. New disciplines emerge all the time. Most recently, for example, cultural techniques, software studies, or media archaeology. It takes years, even decades, before they gain dedicated shelves in libraries or a category in interlibrary digital repositories. Not that it would matter that much. They are not only sites of academic opportunities, but firstly, frameworks of new perspectives of looking at the world, new domains of knowledge. From the perspective of a researcher, the partaking in a discipline involves negotiating its vocabulary, classifications, corpus, and specific terms or subjects. Creating new fields involves all that and more, even when one goes against all disciplines. My second remark, Google can still surprise us. And the third one, Knowledge has been in the making for millennia. There have been abstract mechanisms established that govern its conditions. We now possess specialized corpora of texts, which are interesting enough to serve as a ground to discuss and experiment with dictionaries, classifications, indexes, and tools for reference retrieval. These all belong to the poetic devices of knowledge making. Thank you. There will be no question. I have some code to show you. Well, maybe
this was a warning?
No, it's either, well, you can choose. No, but I will show you, I mean, depends. Okay, I will wait.
I think that it's a great. I was lucky enough to recognize the URL, so then I was like, I think that it was much easier if one would read together with your reading.
Yeah.
So just for the next time, I suggest others to do that, or just to recognize what's the algorithm. But that's part of my question. So part of my question, why it's part of my question, is that I recognize that that's the algorithm which I use, which I recognize, which I use my pattern recognition algorithms in my mind. So that's what I did, and that's why I'm bringing that. And then another one is that there is a recent, especially like a media theory, leftist media theory.
Yeah.
I would say there is quite some trend of writing about algorithms, algorithmic society, and things like that, as that's something which is hidden from the public, hidden from the people, and because of being hidden, is actually very dangerous, because it gives the control to the ones who are using these algorithms. So what I know about algorithms from kind of software programming is that most of the algorithms which they criticize are very transparent. They are papers, and they are quite kind of like formally followed. Like, for example, PageRank by Google. And what I like in your lecture, what is kind of obvious, is that these are almost like a common sense after you recognize that these are just following what humankind was doing for like 1,000 years, and then it got formalized, and then it was named algorithm, and then it got implemented. So in a way, I would say that just like brings a little bit of new mystification of that. So algorithm became, in a way, a signifier of some kind of a political kind of a threat, political danger. And I like it in that position. I subscribe to that. I like what it brings. In terms of the clarity of what we know, or what we could know about the algorithms, I think that it leads in a wrong direction. And it seems to me that what we kind of name here as dangerous is maybe also emancipating, because most of the algorithms which are actually non-transparent are the subjective, are the ones which we use but never formalize. So that's why the beginning of my question has something with what I'm saying now, because I made my algorithm, or like a pattern matching of my behavior at the beginning. So I kind of formalized it, so you can now refer to that. But if I didn't, then you wouldn't know any of that. So my question, just to like to finish, is how do you feel? Did you read any of these, and how do you feel? What's your take on the recent take of the academia, mainly on the algorithms, algorithmic society, and that kind of relation to the corporations and other things?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you refer to as criticism of studying algorithms.
For example, there are a lot of texts which are saying that Google PageRank is non-transparent, and the major danger which comes from Google is that we don't know what they do. And what I claim is that it's pretty, clear.
No, but do you know, Do you know all the indicators they use? Nobody
That's the algorithm. Indicators are more like a...
part of it. No, let's not think about algorithm purely from the software perspective.
Mm-hmm.
There are...
Can I add a word?
Yeah.
Some instructions?
No, the algorithms are more passive than instructions.
Yeah,
But let's see. It is an aid of thought, as a structure has been for decades, as kind of binary logic was for millennia, as kind of thinking in kind of mechanical physics about body and mind and things happening in the world. It's a figure of thought, as far as I employ it myself, and in that case, it's a helpful aid. So to view software through this perspective is of course very kind of fitting, and that's why also more metaphor, like more concepts or more words, more terms from software are being employed to talk about other things. That I would be maybe more cautious about. But yeah, algorithms are quite abstract thing to me. Yeah. Not that software is not abstract; it's also quite.
I don't know if it's. I'm in the point now where I'm thinking, but maybe because I would like to talk more about the poetic, as you say. You are talking about this indexing categories of topics, but it's very important to form historicity, how to order the memory, how to order the document, but we are always referred because normally it's a discussion that we had before, that when we are talking in the art context, normally with the artist about archiving thing or ordering thing, normally our position is again the archive, the way of ordering the thing, to prevent this machinery that want to control us. So normally we are like an artist, looking for other way to ordering, not that you say, not categorize in the way that everybody was ordering the memory or something. And for me, at that point, this is very long discussion maybe. Foucault is very, very important indeed. But finally, Foucault was always constitute the archive ordering discourses. And then for us, for artists, this is something that we didn't talk before here, that I am more interested in some kind of other position that it was very interesting in the 30s, like how to order images, that is more complex than to order text. Because other text you say, we can order alphabetically, but image historically for a historian is quite complex. And then in the 30s, that it was this time that for me there are three atlas or ways of order or archive. That one is Jean-Baptiste document, and the other is Benjamin the Passage Berker, we say, and the other, of course, Avi Barok with the Allat Nemo. I don't know, it's not a question, if you think about this, another way of ordering the knowledge of indexing this imaginary that we are, this pollution that we are living now, that there are millions of visual impact that we are living inside.
Yeah, basically dealing with it all the time. So, yeah, maybe what you mentioned about archive, think the only way to escape archive is to leave no trace. So it's possible, but yeah, it's challenging, and I don't see much reason to do it as a kind of longer term practice. It can be this long. Yeah, it would be interesting. This what's it called? Long-term art, long-duration art that somebody could live without leaving trace for 20 years, and then it would be an interesting piece. But yeah, I mean, there are certainly many things to be done outside the archive. But with the ordering, I was mostly talking about the text, which was of course biased about. I mean, I hope it didn't give the impression that all knowledge is text, but this was kind of the medium discussed. And yeah, I mean, in regard to text, there are not that many. I mean, of course. I mean, the whole history is full of experimentation with the ordering of text. But now I think the new interesting things to be done with text is mostly with help of software. And of course, I mean, it's not the only, but it gives more. I mean, there's lots of things to be done in it, and it's also, I would say, more political. Because it's governing how we daily, how we maybe even think, being in contact with the machines almost. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, well, it's very complicated.
Yeah, but yeah. I mean, with Warburg and yeah, it's about image. It will be very interesting to have. Try to think about image, but yeah, it will be. I have enough of this for now.
Well, it's something not exploited by the technology and stuff. So people is using this. It's used in another training that you said the mathematics, all the definition that we have. So we have the computer, totally connected.
That's a small question.
Yeah, we can talk afterwards.
It's connecting with the politics of the war and everything. So computers, files.
Maybe it's coming up right.
Yeah, I just wanted to riff tangentially to rant a bit, because you see there is this thing as social responsibility. Before I've shown a little sticker I made for computers saying Turing was not Oppenheimer. Like, he wasn't busy thinking of consequences of what he does. And I believe that now that we have signature killings, which is, I believe, a very interesting application of algorithms, right? Over big data. Signature killings, it's like on one hand you have something like PRISM, which is this little algorithm application that reads through all communications, and then it discovers a pattern, like you were describing discovery of patterns, and then it sends a request to a drone. These are these little pieces of hardware that fly around, and then you get killed, you die, you're no more. So this is one application of metadata that we see is fully functioning and is being used as we speak. I have an application on my iPhone, Apple, one famous sponsor. I have an application on my iPhone called Metadata, and it is actually giving me real-time information on the number of dead by drone attacks throughout the world, and it is all about the same invention you are now describing here. And all I wanted to riff about is that there is always a second step, a second chapter, or follow-up to a story of an invention like this. But now, unfortunately, outside the options for quantitative analysis of a corpus or for single text or comparison between authors, we also have this application where, I can imagine easily my reader, similar to the cooking device at Solitude, that my ebook reader is made by the same hardware maker that does drones at the same time, or you know, and rats on me. And if my ebook reader knows I'm strictly reading Foucault all day, there will be a drawing about. It's interesting. This is what you make me think of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Just a brief.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? This is not a kind of rocket science. I was mostly saying obvious things and showing a few, maybe giving some ideas what can we do with texts. So, yeah, I cannot see anything dangerous.
I can. I'm telling you, I can.
Well, but there maybe is a difference between the abstraction of the algorithm, the structure of law, and the difference to instructions, because you need the permission to kill.
Well, if you're the one printing permissions.
I thought I would be interested to come back to this question of poetics, and I had one thought that I was thinking about that your talk was named Poetics of Research and not Poetics of Search, and that is an interesting difference. Searching is you search for something that is already there. Search for my keys, they must be somewhere, but definitely they should be there somewhere. Yeah? But research actually makes sense when we come up in the end with something that we didn't expect. So that might bring up something new. And then my naive understanding of algorithms brings into this maybe a more something that doubles, that is in between, in the sense that algorithms are something that is applied to something that is there, that is already there, but that in the end somehow we hope for, at least when we think about algorithms that on page in music brought into play, that we hope for by applying an algorithm that we apply on what is there already. In reality, that it reorders it in a way that it brings up results that are unexpected. That is one aspect.
I think for I kind of set my agenda as, okay, if I'm going to talk about poetics of research, I will talk about poetical devices of research and what are the means of doing it. Also because this is what Aristotle's poetics is doing with tragedy. It's talking about its devices and means, and it was pretty much my only reference in regard to what to think of as poetics. So yeah, that's very limited. But I didn't have much references about what can be poetics or research. I couldn't find much about it. So yeah, I didn't do enough, or I don't know. Anyway, but the difference between search, yeah, that's the difference. That research, especially now with this media technology, whatever it is, paper, it's recorded. So the process of it is recorded, and so it's necessarily producing something, even if it doesn't kind of come up with some nice final work. So that is always making something in a process of research, and this is also my grounding in what kind of how I employ internet, and then monoscope is pretty much part of it. That's it's making the reading and writing online. Sorry.
So what I thought about maybe it brings into sight another conception of the new also. So that normally the new is somewhere in the future, coming up out of nothing. Yeah. But when turning it around, the new is somewhere there when you look backwards.
No.
And that is maybe a more interesting conception of the new because it works with what is there.
Yeah, exactly. It's the past is full of great things.
I must a little bit intervene. We have 2 more candidates for a question. I would suggest that these questions are short and the answers too.
Yes, when Marcell was asking you about algorithm, you answered that algorithm was not so interesting for you because they are too abstract, and you said that you prefer speaking about indicator, but you didn't explain what an indicator is.
Yeah, that was particular example of paging, and I didn't say that I'm not interested in algorithms. To clarify, I meant to that in Google's algorithm of indexing pages, there is also something we don't know about, which is which are the indicators there, and they're part of the whole thing. I mean, the algorithm. So,
but you can't define them.
No, because I mean, define. We can. It's not easy.
It's mostly how they indicate the span, so what is inclusive, what is exclusive, because a lot of people want to get on top of Google search, and then they have something which is hidden, and that's like how they actually realize that something is spam, and then they say, this doesn't go into business. That was what you were referring to?
Yeah, I mean, spam is of course, or whatever else. Yeah. Oh, fast.
So the question would be, if words produce queries, they also produce then some structure of querying, obviously, and then sequences of words or statements further transform this structure. Would you say that the corpus is fundamental to the structure of querying, and then would the corpus be the starting point for looking at the poetics? So the practice of collecting, would it be a starting point for poetics, query?
Well, the corpus is certainly I mean, from the perspective of your text, work with text, that's the playground. So, it's to work on this playground. There are various devices or things we can do with it. So yeah, I didn't mean that the corpus itself is something poetical. It's more about what do we do with it, and yeah, you meant that structure and query has something to do with what is in the corpus.
So the corpus structures the types of queries done against it.
I think it's more it's about this how the corpus is indexed, and this indexation also conditions how query, and also interface how query can be formulated. So yeah, it's kind of architecture of it. Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure if
Okay. Talk with a glass of water or something. Later on. So we're going on? Or a little...
I think we have make like a little break of like 5 minutes or so, because also we must rearrange because the next format is the podium.
Luxurious.
So yeah, I would say like 5, maximum 10 minutes. Thank you.